Let's use sounds from a market instead of synthesized waves now. At first, the original sound. And now with XCrush. I choose the adjustments from the very first experiment again to compare the results with those of a sine wave or a saw wave being modulated by XCrush. The relation length to birth is going to be 100:49 again. Between lengths of the grains of 1 up to 8 milliseconds we get a whole bunch of different effects, from noise over blown bottles and whistles to drones. At a length of 3 milliseconds we get at least an idea of a bell sound. From 9 milliseconds to about 38 milliseconds the pitches get lower, like in our last experiments. Above 38 milliseconds the higher parts of the spectrum get stronger. In our last experiments the higher frequencies occurred here. With grain lengths of more than 60 milliseconds the modulations get gradually weaker, but in contrast to our last experiments, it needs really long grains to make them almost vanish. At about 600 milliseconds, the voices in the background start being understandable. A lot later, at about 4500 milliseconds, even the voice in the foreground gets understandable. Summary: only one basic principle is valid even with this complex and permanently changing source of sound. The longer the grains are, the weaker is the modulation. Apart from that, we get very different results. Very different from our first experiments with sine waves and saw waves. It's the changes in the sound that makes XCrush react so differently. I'd like to say the XCrush parameter lives on changes. We have to divide the relevant changes into two groups. Group 1 contains changes in the raw, unprocessed sound source, the input material, whereas changes of the parameters of CrusherX belong to Group 2. I'm going to find out what happens when I modulate the timbre, respectively the waveform, and the pitch, and the volume, the loudness, of the input signal. And from the second group I'll take a detailed look at the modulation of the length of the grains, and the birth parameter, and the type of grain window, of the grains windows. Well, let's return to synthesized waves and apply some changes to them. I'll change a sine wave into a saw, and vice versa, using an automated phase distortion with an adjustable frequency of the transformation. When we want to find out the impact of changes in the raw sound input on the way XCrush modulates this input, we have to take care that the raw sound changes fast enough. At least one circle of changes should fit into the period of time the grains overlap, because otherwise we are changing the input while there is no XCrush modulation at all outside the overlapping region. I don't want to calculate too much in this video, therefore I choose a length to birth relation of 2:1, 100:49, to have XCrush modulation all the time. I'm going to repeat the very first experiment with this new setup. Length to birth ratio is 100:49. There is a rather slow modulation of the waveform of the transformation sine to saw to sine. The result is quite different from what we got before. With grain lengths between 1 and 50 milliseconds, we get mainly drones. No bellish sounds anymore. The perceived pitch decreases dramatically. Between 50 and 60 milliseconds, the pitch returns to original level, and between 60 and 100 milliseconds, bands of higher frequencies occur, and the lower frequencies, the bass, vanishes from the sound. Above 100 milliseconds, the results approximate more and more those of our first experiment, but for the fact that it sounds much more nasal than before. Let's try the same experiment once again, but with a melody, meaning with changing pitches of the input sound. The result is the same, with one difference. There is a basic frequency to be heard, which is unchanged by the developing of the melody and which doesn't have a correspondent note. This note-like pitch occurs as a result of the interaction between the modulation of the input material and the modulation by XCrush. I try a faster transformation of the input wave. At first, the single note, then the melody. Well, no fundamental differences to before. It seems that the pure fact of input modulation makes the difference, whereas the frequency of this input modulation is not as important. I'm going to try a different length to birth relation, 100 to 74, meaning that only 26% of the grains overlap, and the all-in-all overlapping rate is 50%. At first, the single note. Between lengths of the grains of 1 to 7 milliseconds, there are bellish sounds again, but they are rather different from those we got without any input modulation in our second experiment in this video. From 8 milliseconds to 50 milliseconds, there are different perceived dominant pitches, and above 50 milliseconds, the XCrush modulation vanishes gradually but rather fast. Let's listen to the melody to finish with timbre modulations of the input material. Let's return to the permanent XCrush modulation and the 100 to 49 relation of length and birth. I want to modulate the input volume now. As you are going to see and hear, again we are entering an entirely new world of sound. Please notice the strong bends of higher frequencies which occur in the spectrum at certain grain lengths. And don't forget what we are going to do now, as XCrush does a kind of amplitude modulation. Ring modulation is a special kind of amplitude modulation. Modulating the input volume means putting an amplitude modulation on top of the bunch of amplitude modulations XCrush is practicing. Let's listen to the result, at first the single note and then the melody. Let me change the group of parameters to modulate and go over to length, birth and window type. With a length to birth relation of 100 to 49, I modulate only the grain's length at first. We get what we could have expected. It's like our very first experiment in fast motion. But when I release the link LB button and modulate birth as well, but using a lower frequency of modulation than that I am modulating the length parameter with, the result gets more complex and more interesting as well. Before I come to the final example, I want to show the effect of different types of grains window. There will be a separate video only about the window types later in the series, therefore only a short demonstration and no explanations for now. I switch all other modulations off and change the window type manually. I must shortly talk about a special aspect now. The results of the XCrush function dealing with sound in the buffer are different from those of the XCrush function dealing with sounds from outside CrusherX, live or from a sequencer. Just two examples shall be sufficient here. A sine wave with XCrush equals 100% coming from a sequencer. In contrast to a sine wave in the buffer. A saw wave coming from the sequencer. In contrast to a saw wave in the buffer. The speed of playing back the buffer's content doesn't fundamentally change the way XCrush works, and the playback speed of sonic material isn't, therefore, of relevance in this video. It's time for the final example now. I'm going to modulate everything. The input volume, the input timbre, so the waveform, the input frequency, the melody, as well as the length of the grains, their birth and the window type. I'll automate the change of the window type this time. I have extended the melody a little and have applied a bit of a delay additionally to the reverb. Each modulation has a frequency different from every of the other modulations. We have 6 modulations and 6 different frequencies of modulation, therefore. As a result, there are permanent changes, new aspects entering the sound and vanishing again. None of the melody's cycles is exactly like the ones you have heard before or like those you are going to hear later. It needs only small changes of the relations of the different modulations to get remarkable changes in the whole sequence. Thank you for listening. The next tutorial is going to deal with the parameter overdrive and the drawing of modulation curves in CrusherX. Thank you and have a wonderful time.